The first time my mother told me I wasn't invited, it was said like a scheduling error, casual, almost polite. "Oh, Claire," she said on the phone, lowering her voice like she was sharing a favor. "It's probably best if you don't come this Christmas. Things are complicated." That was how it started. Not with a fight, not with shouting, just a quiet removal, like sliding a chair back from the table and pretending no one noticed. My name is Claire Holloway. I was 31 that winter. I lived in Portland, Oregon, worked as a senior compliance analyst for a mid-sized healthcare firm, and for most of my adult life, I had believed that keeping my head down was the same thing as keeping the peace. I was wrong. Christmas had always been the one fixed point in my family. No matter how strained things felt the rest of the year, we gathered at my parents' house in Evanston, Illinois. Brick colonial, white shutters, the same pine wreath on the door every December. My father, Thomas Holloway, liked traditions because they made him feel in control. My mother, Diane, liked them because they made things look normal. That year, the call came on December 10th, 15 days before Christmas. Enough time for the exclusion to feel intentional. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the half-packed box of ornaments I had already pulled out of storage. My mother kept talking, explaining without really explaining. "Your brother's bringing Olivia," she said. "And with everything going on with the family business, your father thinks it's better to keep things streamlined." Streamlined. Like I was clutter. I didn't argue. I didn't ask what everything meant. I had learned a long time ago that questions only made them defensive, and defensiveness always turned into blame. Instead, I said, "Okay," in the same tone I used at work when a meeting got canceled. After we hung up, I stood there for a long time. The kitchen felt too quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Snow fell outside my window in slow, careful flakes, like the world was trying not to disturb me. This wasn't the first time I had been edged out of something important. It was just the first time it had been done so cleanly. Growing up, my younger brother Nathan had always been the axis my family rotated around. He was 2 years younger, louder, more confident, and from an early age, clearly my father's heir apparent. Nathan liked to say he fell into the family business, but the truth was he had been placed there, guided carefully, praised loudly, protected fiercely. Holloway Industrial Supply wasn't glamorous. It distributed specialty components to construction and manufacturing companies across the Midwest. But it was profitable, steady, and to my father, sacred. He had built it from nothing after my grandfather died, and he spoke about it the way some men spoke about legacy or bloodlines. I was never invited into that world, not directly. When I was 12 and asked if I could help file invoices during summer break, my father laughed and told me to focus on school. When Nathan did the same thing at 14, my father bought him a laptop. I learned early that my role was not to inherit or lead. It was to accommodate. I went away for college on a partial scholarship, paid off my loans myself, built a career that had nothing to do with pipes, valves, or distribution contracts. On paper, I was successful. Good salary, stable job, clean record. But in my family's eyes, I was always adjacent. Useful in theory, optional in practice. That Christmas call made something painfully clear. I wasn't being excluded because I was difficult. I was being excluded because I was unnecessary. 3 days later, Nathan called. "Hey," he said, too casually. I could hear dishes clinking in the background. He was probably at my parents' house. He was there often. "Mom said you took the Christmas thing pretty well." I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "There wasn't much to take." He paused. "Look, it's not personal. Dad's under a lot of pressure. The board's been on him about restructuring, and Olivia's parents are flying in. It's just not the right moment." Not the right moment. I had heard that phrase my entire life. "What restructuring?" I asked. There was a beat of silence, just long enough to tell me I had stepped into something I wasn't supposed to know about. "You know," he said lightly, "internal stuff." I didn't push. I thanked him for calling. We hung up. But that silence stayed with me. It followed me into the night, into my dreams, into the week that led up to Christmas, when my phone filled with photos I hadn't asked for. My parents' living room glowing with lights. A long dining table set for 8. Nathan and Olivia clinking glasses. My mother smiling in her green velvet dress. My father at the head of the table, looking pleased. No empty chair. No mention of me. On Christmas morning, I woke up alone, made coffee, sat by the window. I told myself I was fine. I told myself this was freedom. No small talk, no subtle jabs, no pretending. But beneath that calm, something had started to shift. In January, I got an email from my father's attorney. It wasn't addressed to me directly. I was copied. The subject line read, Preliminary Estate Review, Holloway. I stared at it for a full minute before opening it. The message was brief, formal, and devastating in its restraint. It referenced upcoming changes to my parents' will, adjustments, clarifications, a meeting scheduled for early February. Nathan was the primary contact. I was listed as not required to attend. That was the moment I understood this wasn't about Christmas. Christmas had just been the test. The quiet removal before the real work began. They weren't pushing me away emotionally. They were erasing me legally. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I closed my laptop, put on my coat, and went for a walk through the frozen streets of Portland. My breath came out in sharp white bursts. My hands shook, not from the cold, but from a realization that settled into my bones with terrifying clarity. Everything I thought was love had been conditional, and the conditions had changed. By the time I got back to my apartment, I knew one thing for certain. If I didn't act now, I wouldn't just lose my place in the family. I would lose my right to choose what happened next, and they would never see it coming. The meeting was scheduled for February 6th at 10 in the morning. The location was my parents' attorney's office in downtown Chicago, a place I had only been to once before, years ago, when my grandmother's trust was dissolved after her death. Back then, I had been 24, quiet, sitting in the corner while adults discussed numbers that didn't feel real to me yet. This time, I wasn't invited. But I went anyway. I didn't announce myself. I didn't storm in demanding answers. I simply showed up, signed in with the receptionist, and took a seat in the waiting area across from the conference room. Glass walls, frosted edges. I could see shapes moving inside. My father's silhouette, Nathan's unmistakable posture, leaning back, one ankle crossed over his knee, Olivia's hair catching the light. They hadn't expected me. That much was obvious when my father finally noticed me through the glass. His head turned sharply, his jaw tightened. For a second, he looked almost unsettled, not angry, caught. The attorney, Harold Benson, stepped out moments later, his expression carefully neutral. He had known me since I was a teenager. He nodded once, polite but cautious. "Claire," he said, "I didn't realize you were joining us." "I was copied on the email," I replied calmly. I assumed my presence wouldn't be disruptive. He hesitated, just long enough to tell me that it absolutely was. Inside the conference room, the air felt heavier. Papers were spread neatly across the table, legal language, charts. I took the empty seat at the far end without asking. My mother avoided my eyes. Nathan watched me with a mix of irritation and something else I couldn't quite place yet. Unease, maybe. Harold cleared his throat and resumed where they had left off. He spoke about estate planning updates, about succession, about protecting the continuity of Holloway Industrial Supply. He used words like efficiency, clarity, future-proofing. Then he said it. The revised will reflects the decision to transfer full ownership of the company and associated properties to Nathan Holloway. No pause, no apology, just fact. I nodded slowly, as if he had just confirmed the weather. "And Claire?" I asked. My father answered instead of the attorney. "You've chosen a different path," he said. His voice was even, practiced. "This isn't a punishment. It's just logical." Logical. That word again. My mother finally spoke, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You're independent," she said softly. "You don't need this the way Nathan does." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of how familiar the reasoning was. Need had never been the metric. Obedience had. "I see," I said. "And the trust Grandma set up?" Harold adjusted his glasses. "That's being restructured. The discretionary portion will be absorbed into the primary estate, which meant it would disappear into Nathan's control. I looked around the table. No one met my gaze, not even Nathan. That was the moment something inside me went still. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I didn't remind them of anything I had done or sacrificed. I simply asked one question. Is this already finalized? Harold hesitated again. The documents are drafted, not yet executed. I smiled, just slightly. Then I'd like a copy, I said, for my records. My father frowned. Why? Because I'm named, I replied, and because I'm entitled to review any legal document that affects me. Silence. Harold nodded slowly. That's reasonable. The meeting wrapped up quickly after that. Too quickly. They had lost momentum. My presence had disrupted the smooth narrative they'd prepared. As they stood to leave, Nathan pulled me aside near the door. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Do what? I asked. Make it awkward. I looked at him then. Really looked. At the man who had inherited everything without ever having to ask. Who still believed fairness was a feeling, not a structure. I didn't make it awkward, I said. I made it visible. He opened his mouth to respond, but my father called his name. Nathan turned away without another word. That afternoon, I sat in my hotel room overlooking the river, the city gray and unmoving beneath the winter sky. I spread the documents across the bed and read them slowly, line by line, clause by clause. The will wasn't just excluding me, it was positioning me as irrelevant. No decision-making power, no assets, no acknowledgement beyond a token personal item allocation that felt almost insulting. But there was something else. A detail buried deep in the trust language. A reference to an older amendment. One tied to my grandmother's original estate plan. It mentioned a contingency clause. One that required unanimous consent from all living descendants to dissolve a specific educational and professional development fund. My name was on that clause. They hadn't removed it. They had overlooked it. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was upset, but because my mind was working too quickly to rest. By morning, I had booked a consultation with an estate litigation attorney. Not one connected to my family. Someone who didn't know our last name. Her name was Rebecca Sloan. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, no patience for sentimentality. She read the documents in silence, tapping a pen lightly against her notebook. They assumed you wouldn't notice, she said finally. Assumed I wouldn't matter, I corrected. She nodded. That too. What are my options? I asked. She looked up at me. You can contest. You can negotiate. Or, she paused, you can leverage what they forgot. I felt a slow, unfamiliar calm spread through me. What does that look like? I asked. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. It looks like control. That night, I flew back to Portland. I didn't call my parents. I didn't respond to Nathan's texts asking if I'd made it home safely. I went back to work. I answered emails. I lived my life exactly as before. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. They thought they had removed me quietly, cleanly, without consequence. They were wrong. And soon, they would understand that silence is not the same thing as surrender. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not friends, not coworkers, not even the one cousin I still spoke to occasionally. Silence had become my shield, and for the first time, it felt intentional rather than imposed. Rebecca moved quickly. She always did. Within a week, she had traced the contingency clause back through 3 versions of my grandmother's trust. The language was old-fashioned, almost quaint, written at a time when my grandmother still believed that family consensus meant something. The fund was called the Halloway Educational and Professional Advancement Trust. It had been designed to support any descendant who pursued higher education or vocational training outside the family business. My grandmother had insisted on it after watching my father push Nathan toward the company before he had finished college. What mattered wasn't the money itself. Compared to the rest of the estate, it was modest. What mattered was control. The clause stated clearly that the fund could not be dissolved, absorbed, or redirected without the written consent of all living grandchildren. There were only 2 of us, Nathan and me. They can't finalize the will without addressing this, Rebecca said during our second meeting. And they can't address it without you. I nodded. absorbing the weight of that sentence. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to my family's decisions. I was standing in the way of them. The first call came from my mother. She left a voicemail. Her voice was tight, carefully pleasant, the way it always was when she wanted something, but didn't want to admit it. Claire, your father mentioned you met with a lawyer. We'd like to understand why you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. More complicated. Not unfair. Not hurtful. Complicated. I didn't call her back. The second call came from Nathan 2 days later. This time, I answered. You blindsided us, he said without preamble. I wasn't invited, I replied. I can't blindside people who don't look at me. He exhaled sharply. You know this isn't personal. That's the problem, I said. It should be. There was a pause. I could hear him shifting, pacing. He always paced when he was uncomfortable. The board's pushing Dad to finalize everything before the end of the quarter, he said. This delay doesn't help anyone. Who is anyone? I asked. He didn't answer. That was when I realized something important. This wasn't just about inheritance. The timing mattered because something else was happening inside the company. Pressure, instability, a need for clean lines and unquestioned authority. They needed the will finalized to project confidence, and I was in the way. Rebecca advised restraint. Let them come to you, she said. Don't negotiate against yourself. So I waited. In March, I got an email from Harold Benson, requesting a clarifying discussion. The tone had shifted, less formal, almost conciliatory. We met via video call. My father joined from his office. Nathan sat beside him, posture stiff. My mother was absent. Harold spoke carefully. There appears to be a provision that requires your consent before certain adjustments can be finalized. Appears to be, I repeated. My father's jaw tightened. Your grandmother never intended for you to use that against us. I met his gaze through the screen. She intended for me to have a choice. Nathan leaned forward. What do you want, Claire? There it was. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement. A transaction. I want my exclusion documented honestly, I said. Not framed as my decision. Silence. I also want the trust left intact, I continued. And I want written assurance that I will not be removed as a beneficiary from any remaining family assets without cause. My father laughed once, sharply. You think this is leverage? Yes, I said, because it is. The call ended without resolution. 2 weeks later, I received a notice from my employer's HR department. Routine on the surface. A request to confirm outside consulting disclosures. It took me a moment to connect it. Halloway Industrial Supply was one of our secondary vendors. My father had made a call. Rebecca wasn't surprised. It's a pressure tactic, she said. Subtle, but effective if you panic. I didn't panic. I documented everything. Emails, call logs, timelines. I disclosed the relationship proactively, noting that I had no financial ties, no decision-making power, no conflict of interest. HR cleared it within days. But the message was clear. They were willing to reach into my life to remind me where they believed my place was. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, the city glowing faintly through the windows. I thought about every time I had stayed quiet to avoid being seen as difficult. Every time I had accepted less to keep the peace. This wasn't new behavior from them. It was just the first time I wasn't absorbing it. The next move came unexpectedly. My grandmother's old house in Michigan went up for sale. It wasn't part of the main estate. It was held separately under the trust, or at least, it was supposed to be. Rebecca flagged it immediately. They're testing boundaries, she said. Seeing what they can move without you noticing. We filed an injunction within 48 hours. The sale was halted. That was the moment the tone changed completely. My father stopped calling. Nathan stopped texting. Instead, I received a formal letter requesting mediation. Not reconciliation. Mediation. It was scheduled for early April. Neutral location, 3 attorneys, 1 mediator. As I prepared, I realized something that startled me with its clarity. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I felt steady. They had spent my entire life deciding things for me. What mattered, what didn't, where I belonged. Now, for the first time, every decision was waiting on me. And whether they understood it yet or not, the balance of power had already shifted. The meeting would decide what happened to the money. But it would also decide something far more important: who I would be when this was over. The mediation room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. Neutral by design. No family photos, no history on the walls. Just a long table, padded chairs, and a clock that ticked louder than it needed to. I arrived 10 minutes early. Not to make a statement, but because I wanted to sit with the space before they filled it. Rebecca arrived a few minutes later, calm as ever, her legal pad already open. She nodded once at me, a small gesture that said, "You're ready, whether you feel it or not." My parents arrived together. My father walked in first, shoulders squared, expression controlled. My mother followed, hands clasped in front of her, eyes scanning the room like she was already uncomfortable. Nathan and Olivia came last. Olivia looked at me briefly, then away. She had never known where to place me. Neither had I, for a long time. The mediator, a man named Alan Pierce, introduced himself and laid out the ground rules. Respectful dialogue, no interruptions. The goal was resolution, not victory. I almost smiled at that. Alan asked my father to speak first. "This situation has escalated unnecessarily," my father said. "We have always intended to provide for our children fairly." I watched his hands as he spoke. They rested flat on the table, fingers spread slightly. A posture of ownership. Alan nodded and turned to me. "Claire, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I simply spoke." "I was removed without discussion," I said. "I wasn't told what was happening. I was told after decisions were already made. That isn't fairness. That's control." My mother shifted in her seat. "We were trying to protect the family," she said quietly. "From what?" I asked. She didn't answer. Nathan cleared his throat. "You left," he said. "You built a life elsewhere. Dad assumed you didn't want to be involved." I met his eyes. Assumption isn't consent. Rebecca slid a document across the table. "This outlines the contingency clause my client is referencing," she said to the mediator. "It also details several actions taken without her knowledge that legally require her approval." Alan reviewed the pages carefully. The room was silent, except for the turning of paper. When he looked up, his expression had shifted. Less neutral, more alert. "There are procedural issues here," he said. "Significant ones." My father's jaw tightened again. "We're not here to be lectured." "No," Alan said calmly. "You're here because this hasn't been handled correctly." The conversation turned practical after that. Numbers, structures, conditions. But beneath every word was something heavier. Years of unspoken hierarchy being challenged in real time. At one point, my mother reached for my hand. I pulled it back. Not sharply. Just enough. That small movement landed harder than any argument could have. The mediation lasted 4 hours. By the end, the outlines of an agreement were on the table. The trust would remain intact. I would be listed as an equal beneficiary in non-business assets. Any future changes would require formal notification and consent. But there was one thing they wanted in return: a statement. Not public, internal. A written acknowledgement that my exclusion had not been malicious. I considered it carefully. "I won't lie to protect your image," I said finally. "But I'm willing to state that the actions were taken without consultation, not with intent to harm." My father hesitated, then nodded. It was the first time he had conceded anything to me. We signed a memorandum of understanding, not the final documents, but enough to bind them. As we stood to leave, Nathan lingered. "You didn't have to make this so formal," he said quietly. "I did," I replied, "because informal is where I disappear." He didn't argue. Outside, the air was cool and bright, spring trying to arrive. I walked with Rebecca to the corner before we parted ways. "You handled that well," she said. "They underestimated you." "They always have," I said. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. But peace, I was learning, is not the same thing as safety. 2 weeks later, the company announced a major internal restructuring, and my name surfaced again. I heard about the restructuring from a stranger. It was a Tuesday morning. I was standing in line at a coffee shop near my office when my phone buzzed with a LinkedIn notification. Someone had commented on a post about Holloway Industrial Supply's strategic realignment for long-term growth. The comment was congratulatory, vague, the kind of corporate language that said nothing and hinted at everything. I opened the post. New leadership roles, new advisory positions, a renewed focus on compliance, vendor oversight, and regulatory alignment. And there it was, buried halfway down the announcement. Creation of an external advisory seat focused on compliance and risk mitigation. External. Advisory. My chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. They weren't inviting me back. They were circling me. 10 minutes later, Nathan called. "Before you hear this from someone else," he said, and I almost laughed at the irony. "Dad wants to talk to you." "About?" I asked. "A role," he said. "Temporary. Strategic." Temporary meant expendable. Strategic meant necessary. "I'll listen," I said. "Not today." There was a pause. "When?" "When it's in writing." He didn't argue. That afternoon, an email arrived from Harold Benson's office, CCing my father and Nathan. It outlined a proposed consulting arrangement. 6 months, fixed compensation, no equity, no decision-making authority, strict confidentiality. They wanted my expertise without my presence, my credibility without my name attached to theirs. Rebecca reviewed it with me that evening. "They're trying to borrow legitimacy," she said, "not share power." "I know," I replied. "What do you want to do?" I thought about the mediation room, the way my father's hands had spread across the table. Ownership, certainty. I thought about the clause they had missed, the house they had tried to sell quietly, the HR call that had come out of nowhere. And I thought about something else, something newer. At work, I had recently been asked to lead an internal review after a minor compliance breach. Nothing dramatic, a reporting error. But the way leadership responded had been telling. They listened. They adjusted. They trusted me to make decisions without asking me to soften them. That trust had weight. "I'll counter," I said, "but not for a consulting role." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "You want in." "No," I said. "I want distance, with leverage." We drafted a response the next day. I would consider an advisory position only if it was independent, publicly acknowledged, and structured through a third-party firm. My firm. Any recommendations would be binding unless formally rejected by the board with documented rationale. Compensation would reflect market rates, and most importantly, the contract would include a non-retaliation clause covering both my professional and personal interests. It wasn't aggressive. It was precise. The reply took 4 days. When it came, it was from my father directly. "Claire," the email began. No greeting beyond my name. "Your terms are excessive." This was meant to be a gesture of goodwill. Goodwill. That word again. As if fairness were a favor. I didn't respond. 2 hours later, Nathan called. "They're nervous," he said. "The board's nervous. There's pressure from suppliers. Audits coming up." "And?" I asked. "And they need someone credible," he said. "Someone clean." Clean. I understood what he meant. No scandals. No outdated practices. No history of cutting corners. Me. "I sent my terms," I said. "They can accept or decline." "You're putting Dad in a corner." "No," I replied. "He built the corner." The silence stretched. Then Nathan said something he had never said before. He's scared. I believed him. That night, I walked through my apartment slowly, touching the edges of my life. The bookshelf I had assembled myself. The framed certificate from my last promotion. The quiet, steady existence I had built without them. I realized then that this wasn't about revenge, not in the dramatic sense. It was about refusing to be used as a patch for a system that had never included me. The next morning, Rebecca called. "They accepted," she said. "Almost all of it." "Almost?" "They want to remove the public acknowledgement." I didn't hesitate. Then no deal. An hour later, the final acceptance came through. My role would be announced. My firm would be named. The advisory position would be independent, contractual, and time-bound. 6 months, renewable only with mutual consent. When the announcement went live, my phone lit up. Former colleagues, industry contacts, people who knew my last name but had never connected it to Halloway Industrial Supply before. The comments were polite, curious, some surprised. My mother called that evening. "I didn't know you wanted this," she said. "I didn't," I replied. You needed it. She was quiet for a moment. Your father feels exposed. I looked out the window at the city lights. That's what transparency feels like when you're not used to it. The first board meeting I attended was virtual. I kept my camera on, sat upright, neutral background, no personal details. My father avoided looking at me. The questions came quickly, about compliance gaps, vendor contracts, reporting structures. I answered calmly, directly. I didn't soften my assessments. I didn't apologize for them. When the meeting ended, the board chair thanked me and said, "This was overdue." My father said nothing. Afterward, Nathan messaged me privately. "You didn't embarrass him," he wrote. "You didn't attack." "I wasn't there for him," I replied. "I was there for the work." That night, as I closed my laptop, I felt something settle into place. For the first time, I was in the room not because I belonged to the family, but because I brought something they couldn't ignore. And that difference mattered more than any inheritance ever could. But the story wasn't finished. Because once systems begin to change, they reveal what was hidden. And what surfaced next would force my family to confront a truth they had buried for decades. The first thing I noticed wasn't a scandal. It was silence. After my second advisory meeting, the questions from the board grew sharper, more specific. They stopped asking what they should do and started asking what they had missed. That shift alone told me everything I needed to know. People only ask those questions when they're preparing for consequences. I requested access to historical vendor contracts. Not all of them, just a sample. 10 years back, 5 vendors. Routine. The files arrived in pieces, inconsistent formatting, missing attachments, handwritten amendments scanned at odd angles. Nothing overtly illegal, but enough irregularity to make my stomach tighten. This wasn't sloppiness, it was habit. I worked late that night, cross-referencing dates and payment schedules. Around midnight, a pattern emerged. A logistics subcontractor called Northridge Transport had been receiving priority renewals despite consistently higher bids. Their performance reviews were average at best, sometimes worse. I checked ownership. The company was registered to a trust in Indiana. The trustee's name stopped me cold. Diane Holloway, my mother. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Not in shock, in recognition. Of course. Northridge had been quietly funneling profits back into a family-controlled entity for years. Not illegal on its own, but undisclosed, undocumented, and in direct conflict with several contracts my father had signed, affirming arm's-length vendor relationships. This wasn't just favoritism. It was concealment. I didn't confront anyone immediately. I flagged the issue in my notes and requested additional documentation under the pretense of a broader audit. No accusations, no conclusions, just questions. The next morning, my father called. "Why are you digging into Northridge?" he asked. His tone was controlled, but there was an edge to it. Not anger, alarm. "Because it stood out," I said. "If there's a reasonable explanation, it'll hold up." There was a pause. A long one. "That vendor's been reliable," he said finally. "Reliability isn't the same as transparency," I replied. He hung up without another word. 2 hours later, Rebecca called me. "Your father's attorney reached out," she said. "They want to clarify the scope of your engagement." "Let me guess," I said. "They want it narrowed. They want Northridge excluded." I let out a slow breath. That won't happen. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "Claire, if this goes where I think it might, you need to be clear about your endgame." I looked at the spreadsheet on my screen. Years of numbers, quiet decisions, the kind that never get noticed until they do. "My endgame is truth," I said. "What they do with it is up to them." That afternoon, Nathan showed up at my apartment, unannounced. I hadn't seen him in person in months. He looked tired. The confident ease he usually carried was gone, replaced by something brittle. "You could have warned us," he said as soon as I opened the door. "About what?" I asked, stepping aside to let him in. He didn't sit. He paced, running a hand through his hair. "About Mom. About Northridge. I didn't know until I saw it," I said. "And when I did, I followed the process." "You know what this could do," he said. "To Dad, to the company." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You mean what hiding it has already done." He stopped pacing and looked at me then. Really looked. "This wasn't about greed," he said quietly. "Mom said it was about security. about protecting assets from risk. I nodded once. That's what control always sounds like when it's dressed up as care. He sank into a chair, the fight draining out of him. The board's going to find it. Yes, I said. They are. And if they do? They'll ask why it wasn't disclosed, I said, and why someone outside the company was benefiting without oversight. He swallowed. Dad's health hasn't been great. I felt the old reflex rise, the urge to soften, to step back, to protect. I didn't. This isn't about punishment, I said. It's about accountability. And it was never my responsibility to keep this hidden. He nodded slowly, like someone hearing something they didn't want to accept, but couldn't deny. 3 days later, the board requested a formal explanation regarding Northridge Transport. They copied legal, compliance, external auditor. My mother called that night. Her voice was different, not careful, not polished, raw. I didn't think it mattered, she said. It was family money. It matters because it wasn't disclosed, I replied, and because it wasn't yours alone to decide. There was a long silence on the line. I never meant to hurt you, she said finally. I believed her. And for the first time, that belief didn't change my position. I know, I said, but intention doesn't erase impact. The board meeting the following week was tense. My father spoke less than usual. When he did, his words were clipped, defensive. The auditors asked precise questions. No emotion, just facts. By the end of the session, the conclusion was unavoidable. The arrangement posed a material risk. Not catastrophic, but serious enough to require action. Northridge would be terminated as a vendor. The trust would be unwound. The transactions disclosed retroactively. My mother would step down from any informal advisory role she had held. No one said my name during that meeting. They didn't have to. Afterward, the board chair messaged me privately. You did the right thing, he wrote, even when it was uncomfortable. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, lights low, the city humming beyond the windows. I thought about my grandmother, about the fun she had protected, about the claws they had missed. She had known. She had known that families confuse love with control, and that someone would need a way out. The fallout wasn't explosive. It was quiet. Meetings, lawyers, adjustments. My father stopped calling. My mother stopped trying to explain. Nathan sent one final message. I don't know where we stand anymore, he wrote. I typed back slowly. We stand where the truth put us. The 6-month advisory term was halfway through, and the company was changing faster than anyone had expected. But so was I. Because once you stop carrying other people's secrets, you realize how heavy they were and how free you feel when you finally put them down. By late summer, the distance between my family and me had stopped feeling temporary. Not dramatic, not explosive, just settled. The weekly check-in calls from my father disappeared. My mother sent polite messages on holidays, short and careful, as if every word might reopen something she didn't want to face. Nathan still forwarded updates from the company occasionally, but they read like reports, not conversations. Work continued. The advisory contract was doing exactly what it was meant to do. Processes were rewritten, vendor disclosures standardized, oversight committees formed. The company was stabilizing, slowly, visibly. And yet, underneath all of that, something else was happening. People were starting to talk. Not gossip, pattern recognition. A junior analyst from the compliance team asked if she could schedule time with me. Then a procurement manager. Then someone from finance. They didn't frame it as complaints. They framed it as questions. Is this normal? Was this ever reviewed? Has anyone else flagged this before? The answer to the last question was always the same. Yes, quietly. The culture hadn't been built on one bad decision. It had been built on 1,000 small ones that no one challenged, because challenging them came at a cost. I recognized that cost intimately. One afternoon, after a long internal session, I closed my laptop and stared at my reflection in the dark screen. I looked older than I had 6 months earlier. Not tired, sharper, more defined. I realized then that the company no longer needed me to survive. It needed me to finish the job. The first official request came in an email from the board chair. A closed-door meeting. No agenda attached. Just a time and a note that read, "We'd like to discuss next steps." I knew what that meant. The meeting took place in early September. My father attended, though he said little. The board chair spoke plainly. "We're considering a permanent compliance oversight structure," he said. "External, independent." My father's jaw tightened. "And we believe Claire's firm would be well-positioned to lead that," the chair continued. Silence. I felt my father's attention shift toward me, heavy and unresolved. "This would require expanded authority," the chair added, "and a long-term contract." I didn't respond immediately. I had learned the power of waiting. "What happens to internal leadership?" I asked. The board chair exchanged a look with another director. There would be changes. My father spoke then, his voice tight. "This is unnecessary." "It's overdue," the chair replied calmly. The meeting ended without a decision, but the direction was clear. That evening, Nathan called. "They're talking about restructuring Dad out," he said. No preamble, no softening. "I know," I replied. "He's furious. He says you're orchestrating this." I closed my eyes briefly. I didn't ask for any of it. "But you're benefiting," Nathan said. "Yes," I said, "from doing my job." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "You're choosing this over us." I thought about that sentence long after the call ended. That night, I walked through my apartment, the same familiar path I had taken 100 times before. But something had shifted. The life I had built, quietly, independently, was now intersecting with the family system I had spent years escaping. I wasn't being pulled back in emotionally. I was being pulled in structurally. And structure is harder to walk away from. Rebecca and I met the next morning. "They're offering permanence," she said, "with power." "And consequences," I added. She nodded. "If you accept, you're no longer just an advisor. You become part of the mechanism." "I already am," I said, "whether I like it or not." "What do you want?" she asked. The question landed heavier than any legal document. I wanted clarity, finality, a clean line between who I had been in that family and who I was now. I also wanted something else, something quieter. I wanted the truth to stop being optional. We drafted a proposal, a long one, detailed, firm. If I took on the role, it would include full independence, reporting directly to the board, not executive leadership. All compliance findings would be documented and non-negotiable. And there would be a sunset clause, a defined endpoint. I would not stay forever. I sent it to the board that afternoon. 2 days later, my father asked to meet. Not at his office, not at the house. At a small diner outside Evanston. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been reheated too many times. He was already there when I arrived. He looked older, not frail, just worn. "I never thought it would come to this," he said. I sat across from him. Neither did I. "You could walk away," he said. "Let this settle." I could, I agreed. But it wouldn't settle. It would rot. His mouth tightened. "You think I built this on rot?" "I think you built it on control," I said. "And control doesn't age well." He stared down at his coffee. "I did what I thought was right," he said. "I know," I replied. "But right for you wasn't right for everyone." He looked up then, eyes sharp. "So what now?" "Now," I said, "I choose based on my values, not my role in this family." The board approved my proposal the following week. My appointment was announced publicly. Independent Compliance Director, 3-year term, board appointed. The article framed it as a modernization move, a commitment to transparency. My name appeared in print beside the company's. My mother didn't call. Nathan sent a single text. I hope it was worth it. I read it twice before replying. It was necessary. That night, I stood by my window, the city lights stretching endlessly in front of me. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet, steady sense of alignment. The kind that comes when you finally stop asking permission to exist. But there was one more reckoning left, and it wouldn't come from the board. It would come from inside the family, at the one gathering they could never avoid. Thanksgiving arrived, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The invitation came from my mother. A text message. No emojis, no softness. "Dinner at 6, Evanston. Your father would like you there." Would like. Not hopes, not asks. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I'll come. I didn't add anything else. The drive from Chicago to Evanston felt longer than it ever had. The trees along the highway were stripped bare, branches dark against a gray sky. The radio played quietly, a talk show I wasn't listening to. My mind kept returning to the same thought. This wasn't about food. It never was. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same. Brick facade, white shutters, a wreath on the door carefully centered. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. The living room was full. Aunts, uncles, cousins, voices layered over one another, polite laughter rising and falling. Conversations paused briefly when I stepped inside, then resumed with a slightly different pitch. People noticed. My mother met me near the entryway. She hugged me, stiffly, her arms light around my shoulders. "I'm glad you came," she said. I nodded. "So am I." Nathan stood near the fireplace, drink in hand. He didn't approach right away. When he did, it was with the careful distance of someone unsure where the line was now. "Hey," he said. "Hey." That was all. Dinner was served at the long table, the same one from every holiday. I took my usual seat near the end. Across from me sat my Aunt Margaret, who studied me with open curiosity. Beside her, my cousin Lisa smiled too brightly. My father entered last. The room quieted without anyone asking it to. He took his seat at the head of the table, unfolded his napkin, and looked around as if taking inventory. When his eyes reached me, they lingered for half a second longer than necessary. No greeting, no acknowledgement. The meal began. For the first 20 minutes, conversation stayed safe. Weather, travel, a neighbor's new baby. The clink of silverware filled the gaps. I ate slowly, listening more than speaking, observing the subtle shifts in posture, the glances that slid toward me and then away. Then my uncle cleared his throat. "So," he said, looking at my father, "big changes at the company." The air shifted. My father nodded. "Necessary ones." "And Claire's leading compliance now, right?" someone else asked. "A cousin, maybe." The tone was curious, not unkind. My father didn't answer immediately. "Yes," he said finally. "She is." All eyes turned to me. I set my fork down calmly. "It's a temporary appointment," I said, "with a clear mandate." My Aunt Margaret leaned forward. "That must be challenging, working so closely." "It's professional," I replied, "not personal." That line landed harder than I intended. My mother's hands tightened around her glass. Nathan stared down at his plate. Then my father spoke again. "Claire has always been very independent," he said. "This role suits her temperament." Temperament. The same word he used when I was a child and refused to bend. I met his gaze across the table. "It suits my qualifications." Silence. Not awkward, not explosive, just heavy. My father looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once. Yes, that too. Dessert came and went. Coffee was poured. People shifted in their chairs, sensing the meal was no longer about food. Finally, my father stood. "I'd like to say something," he said. No one moved. "I know this year hasn't been easy," he continued, "for this family. There have been disagreements, decisions that were misunderstood." I felt my spine straighten. "But," he went on, "the company is stronger now, more stable, and that matters." He paused, then added, "Sometimes progress requires difficult choices." I waited. Everyone did. He didn't say my name, didn't say thank you, didn't say sorry. He raised his glass instead. To family, glasses lifted around the table. Slowly, unevenly. I lifted mine too, but I didn't drink. After dinner, people drifted into smaller groups. The children disappeared into the basement. Coats were fetched. Conversations softened. My father approached me near the kitchen. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a request. We stepped out onto the back porch. The air was cold and sharp. The yard stretched dark and quiet beyond the railing. "You've made your point," he said. I looked at him. "That was never my goal." He frowned. "You've upended things. Things that needed to move," I replied. He shook his head slightly. "You always had to push." "No," I said. I finally stopped absorbing. That landed. He looked away, out at the yard. "You didn't have to expose your mother." "I didn't expose her," I said. I refused to hide it. He was quiet for a long time. When you were younger, he said finally, you never needed us. I felt something loosen in my chest. I needed you, I said. I just didn't need control. He didn't respond. We stood there in silence, two people separated by years of unspoken expectations. Inside, laughter rose again. The sound of dishes, life continuing. I won't apologize, he said at last. I didn't ask you to, I replied. When I left that night, no one stopped me. No one asked me to stay longer. My mother hugged me again, a little tighter this time. Nathan nodded once, his expression unreadable. As I drove away, I realized something with quiet certainty. That dinner had not been about reconciliation. It had been about acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, without change, is just another form of distance. There was one chapter left in this story, not at the table, but in ink. The documents arrived by certified mail 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. No warning, no call, just a thick envelope waiting on my kitchen counter when I came home from work. The return address stamped with my parents' attorney's name. The weight of it told me everything before I opened it. This wasn't conversation. This was paper. I set my bag down, washed my hands, and made tea before touching the envelope. Old habit. Delay as control. When I finally sat at the table and broke the seal, my movements were steady. Inside were revised estate documents. Not the will itself, an amendment. My name appeared exactly twice. Once to formally acknowledge my exclusion from any ownership interest in Halloway Industrial Supply, past or future. Once to request my signature. They weren't asking for permission. They were asking for closure. The language was clean, clinical. It framed the change as a mutual understanding reached after careful consideration. It referenced my separate professional trajectory and my desire to remain independent of family business interests. It was almost elegant and entirely false. I read it twice, then a third time, slowly, looking for what wasn't said. There it was, tucked into the final paragraph. A release clause. If signed, it would waive my right to contest any future changes to the estate, including the trust, including the educational fund my grandmother had protected. They wanted me out, permanently. I didn't call my parents. I didn't call Nathan. I called Rebecca. She listened quietly as I read the relevant sections aloud. When I finished, she exhaled. They're trying to lock the door while you're still standing in the hallway, she said. Can they do it without me? I asked. No, she said, not cleanly. But if you sign this, you hand them everything they still don't have. I stared at the papers spread across my table. The neat margins, the precise language, the illusion of fairness. What happens if I don't sign? I asked. They escalate, Rebecca replied. Pressure, guilt, maybe threats. And legally, you maintain leverage, she said, and you gain something else. What? Time. That night, my mother called. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was brief. Careful. We sent you some paperwork. Your father wants this settled before the end of the year. Settled. As if this were an open tab. The next call came from Nathan. This one, I answered. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be, he said. For who? I asked. For everyone, he replied. I leaned back in my chair. Everyone has been comfortable without me for a long time. That's not fair, he said. No, I agreed. It's accurate. He lowered his voice. Dad thinks you're doing this to punish him. I was quiet for a moment before answering. I'm doing this to protect myself, I said. If that feels like punishment, maybe he should ask why. There was a pause. Then Nathan said something that surprised me. He's scared of losing control. I smiled faintly. So am I. That's why I'm not signing. The pressure increased after that. Emails from the attorney. Polite reminders. Deadlines. Warnings about administrative delays. Nothing overt. Nothing threatening. Just a steady drumbeat meant to wear me down. Then came the dinner invitation. Christmas Eve. Just immediate family. I declined. The response was swift. My father called. No voicemail. He wanted to speak directly. I answered. You're forcing this to become something it doesn't need to be, he said. I didn't start this, I replied. You could end it, he said. By erasing myself? I asked. I've already lived that version. It doesn't work. He was quiet for a moment. You think you're entitled, he said finally. I think I'm done being managed, I replied. The call ended without goodbye. Rebecca and I met the following week. We spread the documents across her conference table. She tapped the release clause with her pen. This is the pivot point, she said. You can refuse, or you can counter. With what? I asked. She looked at me steadily. With terms. We drafted a response that afternoon. I would not sign the amendment as written. However, I was willing to formalize my separation from the family business under specific conditions. The trust would remain intact and independent. My consent would be required for any future dissolution. A no retaliation clause would extend beyond the company to personal and financial matters. And most importantly, any statement regarding my exclusion would reflect that it was initiated unilaterally by my parents, not by me. It wasn't emotional. It was factual. We sent it by courier. The reply didn't come for 6 days. When it did, it wasn't from the attorney. It was from my father. 3 sentences. This is unacceptable. You are making a mistake. We will proceed without you. Rebecca read it twice, then looked at me. They can't, she said. Not entirely. What happens now? I asked. She closed the folder. Now we wait. And we prepare. Prepare meant filing a notice of intent, a formal record that I was disputing the amendment and reserving my rights. It didn't stop them from trying, but it put everything on record. Once that notice was filed, something interesting happened. The board reached out, not about compliance, not about my role, about governance. They had been informed of family-related legal uncertainty that could affect company stability. They wanted clarity. Risk assessment, contingency planning. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who had tried to erase me quietly now had to explain why I was suddenly a legal variable. I prepared a report. Clean, neutral, thorough. It outlined potential risks, including unresolved estate disputes involving key stakeholders. It made no accusations. It named no names. It was enough. The board postponed several strategic decisions pending resolution. Pressure shifted. For the first time, my refusal to sign didn't just inconvenience my family. It cost them time. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I realized something fundamental had changed. This was no longer about inheritance. It was about authorship, who got to write the final version of my story. And for the first time, the pen was in my hand. By January, the silence had turned strategic. No calls, no emails, no holiday messages. Just the occasional notification from Rebecca when another procedural delay landed on her desk. My parents weren't retreating. They were recalculating. I recognized the pattern because I'd lived inside it my entire life. When direct pressure failed, they waited. When waiting failed, they reframed. The reframing came in the form of a lawsuit, not against me, against the trust. They filed a petition in Cook County to dissolve the Halloway Educational and Professional Advancement Trust, citing changed circumstances and administrative inefficiency. It was elegant, indirect, designed to look reasonable on the surface, but it named me, not as a defendant, as an interested party whose consent could not be reasonably obtained. That phrasing was deliberate. It painted me as obstructive without ever saying the word. Rebecca called me as soon as the filing hit the docket. They're trying to go around you, she said. Judicial override. Can they? I asked. She paused. They can try. We met that afternoon to prepare a response. This wasn't mediation anymore. This was formal, adversarial, public record. As we worked through the filing, something became clear. My parents' argument relied heavily on one assumption: that the trust no longer served its original purpose because neither Nathan nor I required educational support. They had missed something. Again, my grandmother had structured the trust broadly. Education, yes, but also professional advancement, continuing training, career transitions, any path that expanded opportunity outside the family business. And I had receipts. Over the past decade, I had paid for certifications, legal coursework, compliance training, all out of pocket, thousands of dollars, all documented, all within the trust's stated purpose. I hadn't drawn from it because I didn't want the strings. That restraint now mattered. We filed our response within the week. A motion to dismiss. Attached exhibits. Clear alignment with the trust's intent. Then, we waited. The court scheduled a preliminary hearing for early February. In the meantime, the board called another closed session. This time, my father didn't attend. The chair got straight to the point. This legal dispute creates exposure. We need to understand whether it affects your ability to serve. I met his gaze through the screen. It doesn't. But it involves the founding family, another director said. It involves governance, I replied. And governance improves with clarity. They asked if I would recuse myself from any decisions touching estate matters. I agreed without hesitation. It was the correct move. Clean, transparent. After the meeting, the chair messaged me privately. "You're handling this with professionalism," he wrote. "That's noted." That night, Nathan called. His voice sounded different, lower, less certain. "They didn't tell me they were filing," he said. "I know," I replied. "I found out from the attorney," he continued. "After the fact." I said nothing. "This isn't how I wanted it to go," he said. "I warned you months ago," I replied, "that informal decisions disappear people." He exhaled. "They're digging in." "So am I," I said. He hesitated, then asked the question he'd been avoiding. "What happens if you win?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "Nothing dramatic," I said. "The trust stays. I keep my rights. Life goes on." "And if they lose?" he pressed. "Then they learn," I said, "that control has limits." The hearing arrived quietly. No reporters, no audience. Just lawyers, a judge, and a dispute that had been years in the making. I sat behind Rebecca at the polished wooden table, hands folded, posture relaxed. My parents sat across the room. My mother stared straight ahead. My father didn't look at me once. The judge listened patiently as their attorney argued efficiency, obsolescence, practicality. Then Rebecca stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She spoke about intent, about foresight, about a woman who had understood that families evolve, but power resists that evolution. She spoke about me, not emotionally, factually. A beneficiary who met every requirement, who had been excluded from decision-making without consent, who was now being labeled unreasonable for asserting rights explicitly granted. The judge asked a few questions, precise ones. Then he said something that shifted the room. "The court is not inclined to dissolve a trust simply because it has become inconvenient." He denied the petition. Not permanently, but decisively enough. My parents' attorney requested time to consider next steps. The judge granted it, but the message was clear. This path would not be easy for them. Outside the courtroom, my mother approached me. She looked smaller than I remembered. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said quietly. I met her eyes. "Because every time I stayed quiet, you mistook it for agreement." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. My father walked past us without a word. That evening, I returned to my apartment and sat in the dark, the city lights blinking below. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. The system had worked, not because it was kind, but because it was documented. For the first time, my family couldn't rewrite the story in private, and they were running out of ways to control the ending. One chapter remained, not in court, but in choice. The days after the hearing were strangely quiet. No legal filings, no calls from attorneys, no messages from my parents trying to explain or justify what had happened. The silence wasn't peace. It was recalibration. I could feel it the way you feel pressure change before a storm. At work, everything moved forward as if nothing had happened. The compliance overhaul I had put in place was showing measurable results. Vendor reviews were cleaner, reporting timelines tighter. External auditors sent follow-up notes that used words like improved and responsive. From the outside, the company looked stable again. Inside my family, nothing was. Nathan was the first to break the silence. He asked to meet. Neutral ground. A coffee shop near the lake, far enough from Evanston that no one would recognize us as the Halloways. He looked exhausted when I arrived. Dark circles under his eyes, his usual confidence dulled by something heavier than stress. "They're selling the Michigan house," he said after we sat down. "My grandmother's house." "They can't," I replied. "It's still under the trust." "They're trying to," he said. "Dad thinks if they liquidate non-core assets, the rest will fall into place." I stirred my coffee slowly. "That house isn't non-core. It's symbolic." He nodded. I know. That's why I'm here. I looked at him then. Really looked. Not as the favored son, not as the future CEO, just as a man who had spent his life benefiting from a system that was finally cracking under its own weight. "What do you want from me?" I asked. He hesitated. "I want this to stop." "So do I," said. "But stopping doesn't mean going back." He rubbed his hands together. "Dad's talking about stepping down. Not publicly, but internally. The board's pushing harder than they're admitting." That caught my attention. "And you?" I asked. He looked up. "I don't want it the way he did. I don't want to rule by fear." I almost smiled. "Almost." "If that's true," I said, "then you need to understand something." "What?" "I'm not your obstacle," I replied. "I'm the boundary." He swallowed. "What does that mean?" "It means the company can move forward without pretending I don't exist," I said. "Or it can keep fighting ghosts." We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of conversation around us filling the space. "I can't undo what they did to you," he said finally. "But I don't want to inherit it either." That was the closest thing to honesty I had ever heard from him. A week later, the board made its move. They announced my father's transition to an emeritus role. No scandal, no press release filled with drama, just a quiet shift in leadership structure. Nathan would assume interim CEO responsibilities under expanded board oversight. My father did not call me. My mother sent a short message. "Your father needs space." I didn't respond. The legal pressure eased after that. The attempt to sell the Michigan house stalled. No further petitions were filed. The attorneys stopped posturing. It was over. Not because anyone had won, but because continuing would cost too much. That realization settled into my bones with unexpected clarity. Power doesn't end in explosions. It ends in exhaustion. The final documents arrived in late March, a formal acknowledgement from the family attorney. The trust would remain intact. The attempted amendment was withdrawn. My rights were preserved without qualification. No apology attached. I didn't need one. That night, I went through old boxes I'd been carrying from apartment to apartment for years. Childhood papers, report cards, drawings my grandmother had kept when no one else cared. At the bottom of one box, I found a letter, her handwriting. Careful, slanted slightly to the right. "Claire, if you are reading this, it means someone tried to tell you that you did not belong. They were wrong. Belonging is not given by permission. It is claimed by clarity. Do not trade yourself for peace. Love, Grandma Ruth." I sat on the floor and held that letter for a long time. The next morning, I made my final decision. I informed the board that I would not renew my contract when the 3-year term ended. I would finish what I started. I would leave the systems stronger than I found them. And then, I would step away. Not because I was pushed out, but because I no longer needed to prove anything. When Nathan called to ask why, I answered honestly. "I don't want my life to orbit this family forever," I said, "even when I'm doing good work." He was quiet. Then he said, "I think I understand." I wasn't sure he did, but I knew I did. One chapter remained, not about them, about me. The last meeting was unremarkable, and that was the point. A long table, neutral faces. A final progress report reviewed line by line. The systems I had put in place no longer needed my voice to enforce them. That was how I knew it was time. When the board chair thanked me for my work, he used words like integrity and rigor. He said my role had changed the company's trajectory. I nodded, accepted it, and closed my laptop without ceremony. There was no applause, no emotion, just an ending that didn't ask me to shrink. I left the building alone. Walked 2 blocks before realizing my shoulders felt lighter than they had in years. Not because I had won something, but because I was no longer bracing for the next move. I didn't go back to Evanston after that. I didn't need to. My parents' house remained exactly where it had always been, but it no longer pulled at me. Distance, I had learned, isn't always physical. Sometimes it's psychological. Sometimes it's legal. Sometimes it's simply the decision to stop waiting for permission. Nathan called a month later. He told me the company was stable, profitable, quieter. He said the board was watching him closely, and for the first time, He didn't resent that. I think Dad thought control was the same thing as leadership, he said. Most people do, I replied. He hesitated. Do you think he'll ever admit it? I looked out my window at the city below, alive and indifferent. That's not my work anymore. We ended the call gently. No promises, no expectations. That was new. In early summer, I drove north to Michigan. The house was still there, weathered, quiet. The porch steps creaked under my feet, the same way they had when I was a child. I unlocked the door with the old key my grandmother had given me years ago, the one my parents had forgotten I still had. Inside, the air smelled like dust and memory. I walked through the room slowly. The kitchen, where she had taught me how to make soup without measuring. The living room, where she had let me read quietly while everyone else talked. The small desk by the window, where she used to write letters by hand. I didn't take anything. I didn't need to. Standing there, I understood something with surprising clarity. The trust had never been about money. It had been about choice. About preserving a space where I could decide who I was without being corrected. That was the inheritance she had protected. When I returned home, I began dismantling the last threads that tied my identity to my family's approval. I updated my professional profiles, declined interviews that framed my story as reconciliation, accepted work that aligned with my values, not my last name. I stopped explaining. My mother sent a birthday card that year. Short, polite, signed with love. I accepted it without reading between the lines. My father did not reach out again. And that was okay, because here is the truth I learned the hard way. And maybe you will recognize it too. Love that requires silence is not love. Belonging that demands obedience is not belonging. And peace that comes from erasing yourself is just another form of control. I was excluded. From dinners, from decisions, from a version of the family that only functioned when I stayed small. So I chose something else. I chose clarity over comfort, documentation over denial. Boundaries over approval. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I didn't retaliate in anger. I signed papers. I called lawyers. I stopped participating in my own erasure. And when the tables finally turned, not through drama, but through process, I understood the quiet power of choosing yourself. Not to punish, not to prove, but to protect. If you've ever been pushed aside by the very people who were supposed to stand with you, if you've ever been told you were difficult when all you wanted was fairness, know this: you are not wrong for wanting a seat at the table, and you are not weak for walking away and building your own. Sometimes the strongest revenge is not payback, it's peace on your terms. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived a version of it in your own family, share your experience in the comments. You're not alone, even when it feels that way. And if you believe that dignity matters more than approval, that boundaries are a form of self-respect, and that choosing yourself is not selfish, then like, subscribe, and stay with me. There are more stories to tell.